Yeah, so that's certainly taboo. People can do a lot of their own um, document inspecting before working out that metaphysics is what is a universalist term for what they're involved in. Um, Epistemology is another field. So how can we know what we know? What could constitute knowledge? What can constitute um, just an imagining, etc., etc., or how can we know what we know? Are all questions of epistemology. What can you know? What do you know, or what do you believe? Are questions of metaphysics. And, so I don't think I will be bringing up with it. It's open for me for people to engage in discussion. I find myself better. I found it like a cool self discipline to have sit at the computer comfortably, take the time to compose and type, and be involved in community discussions. You don't know how anyone sounds. You don't know uh, anyone's real names. Um, a lot to it is really you either work out you're a person who's interested in these categories of life, or you know you would have given up on the amount of time you would invest in patronizing these online community services. Um, and so a lot of it had to do with, yeah, the claim that I also would never go or become a member of even a Christian forum unless they had stated in their uh, that unbelievers were welcome there for discussion and debate. Time passes, years can pass really, and you'll start to get a bit of a sixth sense for okay, these lines of conversations possibly tick off such and such a person or persons, and or when um, I'll I'll go and think of this matter further. Words like that aren't used, or uh, I admit or concede to have lost to a particular discussion. If you went to saying if you can make a case for theism that has veracity and is valid, then um, I'd be prepared to convert. Um, but yeah, you can do that, and what because I was interested in whether things like what were being said, which I wholeheartedly disagreed with at my previous church, things like get them young and any way you can, um, which I took to mean to be about converting them to Christianity, uh, was disgusting because it was an explicit statement of complicity with trickery. They'll do things like invoking a story of a suicidal tragedy, which, and I would agree that any story about anyone pushed into suicide was tragic. Um, even, yeah, um, But when that's used, and then you're not allowed to ask, well, when Jesus carried his cross up the hill, could he have possibly been suicidal? No, this was a planned sacrifice, and the more recent the gospel, the more the story's theme changes to how this was not just a pre-planned sacrifice, but like Tom Cruise starring as Jesus, God planned it since the start of creation, and uh, just you think this is pathetic that you aren't ruling out. And it's funny because then they'll turn to art, which even if art was singing at you, kill yourself, as song lyrics, because of the categorical imperative definition there. You've got an art is not a military superior. It is not the head of state. It is not a direct order. It is not a series of commandments and injunctions that you must obey. Art stands for art means artificial in shorthand, but it's telling you what types of thinkers are classifying shit, because you know, if they want you to believe um, oh, they had to inbreed to get the human race started, we'll call that creation in the image of God. That story alone is why no one's why I think it gives. And oh yeah, when I say I'm not one, said to be under one name, means uh, what could be fairly said to one could be fairly said about all. Panders to that whole the death of one is a tragedy, which you should show your respects by eating and drinking the symbolic blood. But the death of a million is a statistic. A number of children under the age of 5 will have died before you've heard this video log. Um, and once you deny a person an individual standing in principle, um, you've done something that the Human Rights Act, I would like to think, was assembled in the first place to get us on the track towards. So with what I was saying earlier about fraud, uh, there's more pluralism in my cases that I'd like to have discussed, that I would request counsel, and I would also request on ruling out, or asking my own questions to rule out that this is counsel that aren't prejudiced, because that's what it's one thing that mental health ad hominems are doing, is that they're definitely promoting street drugs, because they'll have people going through tremendous amounts of suffering and ailments, and if there's a psych stamp on a envelope, then maybe it's just mental pain. Why don't you check at your afterlife location of when you go to the federal government Commonwealth of Heaven, or the federal government Commonwealth of Hell, depending on your final judgment. So I'll use two analogies in these next couple minutes. One, if is a question based on analogies, and that's if you were hired by a bank uh, for the total of 9 years, the better part of 9 years, to be taught that a teller, in your role, your capacity as a teller, um, so that as you move further up in the business, the owners want to make sure you aren't to tell on them for robbing banks, and you want to leave the business after learning that. Are you wrong, and should you be punished for it? The second is, if, the way, particularly with being religious people judging, and I've watched them try and do this with art pieces that have Socratic questioning, and followed up with direct quotations about direct statements about art being a question mark rather than an answer. It couldn't have been more kindly spelt out any more plainly or clearly. It was as plain as a dog's balls, is the expression my former employer would use, but I haven't spent that much time sparingly staring at dogs' balls to get the analogy. But a religious person up the chain. So you try and ask yourself to imagine ways, hows and whys that artists and art can be hated, and it can be to do with things like, if you were acquainted with art, then you might think about why, if a show is put on, don't need to even name one or a genre of show, that the people who were set to run the show, appear in the show, talk about various issues in the show, had to answer to people who, at any point in the chain of command, so to speak, wouldn't know how to differentiate their agenda, or they may not know their own superiors' agendas, and that's the thing. So is that therefore deceit? Is another truth, lie versus truth dichotomy. Like, well, there's never been a football match with more than two teams, and so yes, it is possible. The question I'm asking to consider is it possible to have a bunch of people do what they think is the moral, responsible, and right thing to do, but then answer to successive hierarchy, if you will, at the top where they're going, and you're how you're invited up that hierarchy. Although even that can be done without explication, is ultimately because, see, those that don't get their God, I kind of look at it this way, that those that don't get their God commanding them, and they're scientists and they are empiricists, and they want to use strong words like facts and matters and we know, and everybody needs then and they're scientific. They're in a scientific field, and they have religious backing. They're not getting their scientists can only be at odds with their faith. Um, so and this can spur drives that then lead them to things like we'll become. This is alleviated if we become like the gods or the rulers over the Christians, for instance. Um, and how's that achieved? Well, hierarchical talk. I mean, we're now at a time where if you were to talk about a conspiracy, they'll say you're liable to be called paranoid just for wanting to talk about it. A conspiracy. Is conspiracy an invalid concept? I can understand it being a concept embraced by an invalid, but it's not an invalid concept. It's why Charles Manson was jailed. Um, in as pertaining to the sum total of those he's said to the lives he's said to have ended. Um, so what you have to ask yourself is how do you the Chinese whispers game can keep getting played around and around and around, with the word getting changed and with everyone laughing, without anyone knowing who changed the word, uh, and things like that. It's conspiracy for kids. And so yeah, if they're saying, oh, well, dismiss this person's uh, human right to expression because they're a insert nutcase synonym word here, etc., etc. Again, amount of situations where you'll have one religious guy going, it sounds like this person's full of hot air, which by all the logistics that go into their grouping methodology would leave you thinking that you would be put, when sent to a psych facility, in group meetings with like dumpling or dim sum steamers or kettles, stovetop kettles or electric kettles, balloons, hot air balloons. But Roger Toll can't be a windbag because capital chemists have their own hot air balloon, and it's full of quality application of liberal scientific method in strict observation and defence of the Constitution of Australia and the Human Rights Commission, because they don't know what Freemasonry is. They know what GST, green price stickers are, because a lot of medicines for your health benefits are GST free. Gary Cancer knows nothing of Moustache's boats in Bateman's Bay. If he has or had the second biggest boat in Bateman's Bay at 2002. Gary Cans and Roger Toll, I think, bound. I think I heard a rumor they were going to meet. Meet sometime possibly in the spring of 2029. Yeah. So it would be a treat, really, to one day know anything about what it could ever mean to work in their business. Um, you know, my annoyance with my own childhood and how people in Canberra talk about it. I wound up becoming sort of best friends with the one who was at least prepared to say the most insulting things to my face, but what was never what what that meant was okay. Now I know to an extent what's being said about me, and because otherwise, without some grasp of that, it can be disconcerting to assess odd pauses and such and such. Um, but that didn't. I even made a song called Turncoat um, with with this person, and I was making it with him, and it was about him as well on some level. Um, and it wasn't a particularly good song of trying to familiarize ourselves um, with software. Uh, so yeah, it's the whys and hows, and I mean my childhood, the 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 bloodier parts of it, which is what all religious people love, uh, as they love the fallacy after this, uh, post post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore because of this. They would go, well, with his experience in early childhood, it would not surprise me if Luke went out and caused a massacre and killed a person and killed a bunch of people. Um, but what if I did a good deed? Um, if I gave it to a charity, what if that was because of my childhood? Or what if I didn't want to work a status quo job because of what's taught and become a media junkie, um, a news junkie who doesn't question the source of ketchup. Um, I always think it's weird. It's up with this Garden of Eden inbreeding thing. Uh, by this time you would have had a string of me and violence drawn out constantly. You would have had incestuous drives. Um, I've been involved prior to turning 18 to have been involved in step families, and I have not, even when puberty hits and there is a capacity for attraction, and you would not be attracting to your own blood. Not even then. Um, so saying someone's pretty um, isn't incest. But yeah, the next, the worst, to on par with this idea that, well, this here must have happened because of this childhood event here, as even the primary cause. It's what I really like about the new Joker movie, is that um, Joaquin Phoenix uh, says what he did. Not so happy that he shot De Niro. Uh, but he says what he did, and he owns up to it. Um, addresses, makes public addresses, and there's that element there of, yeah, this is what I did, this is why, taking responsibility. But yeah, with the media, I understand too that, I was watching uh, part of a story about a family, and they were talking about the accused, the male, had dropped a young daughter 59 meters, um, and the mother had to stand and give her permission for Pau to be cut to the life support machine. And that is this is one interesting distinction that I do think about, and that is when you have ideas like freedom of the press, which, if the system worked, there wasn't margin for error and corruption. If you know the religious guys just to fuck up. If you got Rupert Murdoch saying bury your mistakes, then that's not a responsible person taking responsibility for mistakes. That's a person promoting concealment and cover-ups. So is freedom of the press uh, all that? You can have you can have I mean, up until controversies that kicked off pertaining to me at the beginning of this decade, my early childhood story was uh, ascertainable upon Google inquiry. And now, what could happen is that the word could go around, well, it's been pulled because it's the cause of a lot of heartache or trauma. But what that would in turn also mean is that um, the same couple of people I'm at odds with, were they to start and kick off a new gen of police investigators or police detail to look into my life. I already spoke to one who said that there are information acts that dispermit the inquiry into, or for that officer's inquiry into uh, um, a person's childhood, insofar as police records go, which didn't make much sense to me, but it was a matter of public record uh, for me. My childhood, my childhood's worst moments were a matter of public record, and they should be left that way now, um, because yeah, ignorance isn't just bliss in one sense. Um, it's solicitation of complacency potentially in others. Where if you go, well, what are these person's circumstances and legal rights and such, police officers and a police detail could be kept ignorant um, from knowing that about matters that they should be thinking about taking into consideration. So So in posing and discussing the question, would it be plausible to think that even if owners of Capital Chemist franchise were to come forward and state that they were of some role in or had something to do with web links to the newspaper article about my childhood, um, if they were to come forward and say that they did that out of consideration for me, one reason they're really bad, put yourself in the mind of the Church of the Freemasons, and is Freemason secrecy um, um, it's certainly more than a myth. If Freemasonry secrecy isn't real, then the Sphinx isn't real, and um, any thoughts that it in its original form contained a nose that could detect sense, um, a bold-faced lie. Um, Freemason secrecy, however, does account for why they. Um, I mean, if I help arrest the shoplifter, and that's how I met them, then is discussing or asking me, is it appropriate to discuss the police case about your childhood with you in certain respects, even something you're prepared to do? I absolutely would have said sure. That would have been the makings of a good friendship. Uh, so into secrecy, more to hide than the desire to appear in press releases themselves, but at the same time wanting to be in press releases themselves, but on their terms and in terms they can control and in a positive light for them, are factors that account for their behavior. Um, and then there is the question, you know, uh, did uh, did they assume I was at the scene? Uh, and the answer to that is yes. Uh, the owners assumed I was at the scene. The owners assumed I learned from the behavior. What threw me until my decision to be a detractor and an apostate from organized religion are the logical entailments of God's existence. See, where there's obviously logical answers and debunking conversational tools that you could use to falsify a group as bigoted as the Westboro Baptist Church. But ask a Christian, why is there suffering in the world? And they'll say, oh, free will was abused by man, and God didn't know about it. And they'll say, yes, he did know about it. Oh, and God's not all loving then. And then they'll go, no, yes, he is all loving. And you go, oh, and God's not all powerful then. And then they'll go, yeah, God's all powerful. And then, well, then, our state of existence would be constantly improving, uh, to the point that heaven would be redundant. We'd have it on earth, and people would say, was it called the kingdom of heaven because it possibly originated from the minds of ancient monarchist political structures? And you might say yes to that. But so that God is not only impossible, it's also not biblical, because Isaiah chapter 45 verse 7 states, I I create evil and I cause woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. And churches tend to avoid any reference to that during sermons because we otherwise might be led to be inclined to think that claims that God loves us all so much are bullshit. Um, so these are not, as some apologists have tried to insist, uh, it's not tantamount to saying, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? Because then that's proof of something that he can't do. Or can God make a square circle? Um, it's a question of that you would then break it down to things like uh, well-being and flourishing is different from person to person. There's the basic levels, and then there are more and more like nuanced manner ways in which this would all happen. And this God being all knowing would simply know all of those things too, uh, and would have the motive um, and the will to by his infinite power. Or you've got or they have to drop words like infinite, um, perhaps indulge the conclusion, the um, on a provisional basis, the provisional philosophical conclusion that man made God after a denial of the limitations of man's own existence and life. And omnipresence, God could be everywhere at the same time. Yada 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 yada. Like that'll do.